Hello everyone, this is Blade Bananas. Welcome to a new video. In this video, I want to really deep dive into the topic of what's the best time to throw your charge moves, depending on what's your fast move turn duration, if it's 2 turn, 3 turn, or 4 turn, and if you're playing it against 2 turn, 3 turn, 4 turn fast moves on your opponent's side. I'm sure there are a bunch of content creators who already touched on this issue. As far as I know that Wallower and FP Sticks have both put out very amazing videos on this topic already, but they haven't really dived into the mathematics behind the reason why we do why we throw our charge moves at some designated durations, or at designated fast move turns, right? So when is the best time to throw charge moves? That's always been a very important question to consider. So here are some factors that I thought would be very important to consider myself. So first of all, these should all contribute to your decision on when do you want to throw your charge moves. So first one, very important, possibility of denying your opponent fast move, if that's something that you want to go for. And then secondly, how many turns we are expecting to give up when we throw a charge move. For example, if we're throwing a 2-turn fast move, if we're a two-turn fast move against my opponent 3-turn fast move, if we throw our charge move after doing one fast move, then we will be giving up 1 turn exactly, right? So these are some things to consider as well. And then we also have to consider the variance of the decision, because for something, for example, if we're trying to deny a fast move from my opponent, then there are some uncertainty. There are cases where it succeeds, and then there are cases where it fails to execute. So there are some variances in that decision, and we have to consider that as well, because variance means uncertainty, right? And then we also have damage registration. So this one is very interesting. For example, if you're playing a 2-turn versus 3-turn fast move, if you do one fast move before you decide to throw your charge move, then you would actually take the damage from your opponent already, because the damage calculation is done exactly 1 turn before the fast move is over. So you would take the damage at 2 turns if your opponent is a 3-turn fast move, right? So this is also something to consider. And then lastly, there is a possibility of your opponent sack swapping. If you throw your charge move perfectly synced up with your opponent, then your opponent could possibly do a sack swap. But if you throw your charge move in the middle of your opponent's charge move, then there is no way your opponent can swap out, right? And I've broken down this into a lot of scenarios. First of all, I want to dive very deep into 2-turn fast moves on our side, because I think that's a very common one to face. So first of all, we have 2-turn fast moves versus a 3-turn fast move timing chart that I made here. So on the very top row is the number of fast moves we do before we decide to throw our charge move. So 1 refers to if we do 1 fast move attack and then throw a charge move. And how many turns we'll be giving up. What about the variance of the turns to give up, and also if we take the damage, and if it's possible for your opponent to sack swap. So this should be pretty straightforward. If we do 1 fast move as 2-turn fast move against 3-turn fast move, then we're giving up 1 turn, right? Because we would do 2. You're in the middle of your opponent fast move. You decide to throw the energy, so we're giving up 1 turn. And the variance is always 0 because there's no uncertainty. We're always giving up this 1 turn to your opponent. And then the damage, like we mentioned earlier in our example, that was taken because the damage is registered at the 2-turn for your opponent 3-turn fast moves, right? So you have to tank that damage. and then your opponent's sack swapping is not possible because you're throwing in the middle of their fast move. And then if we do 2 fast moves before we throw our energy, then we're giving up 2 turns, because then we would have done 2 fast moves of 2 turns, which means we're at 4 turns, and then that's at the beginning of your opponent's second fast move. So your opponent will actually have done 2 fast moves as well, so they would basically get 6 turns compared to our 4 turns. So we will always be giving up 2 turns. And again, the variance will be 0. The damage in this case, however, is that we don't take the damage for the next fast move, which means that we can actually transfer the second fast move attack from your opponent to a Pokemon that we may have sitting in the back. And again, it's not possible for your opponent to sack swap because they're still in the middle of their animation for the second fast move. Alright, so next is when it gets interesting. What if we throw after 3 fast moves? This perfectly syncs up to your opponent 3-turn fast moves. So when we do 3 fast moves of 2 turn, your opponent does 2 3-turn fast moves. So you would each spend 6 turns, right? So now it syncs up, and now sometimes you're able to deny your opponent fast move going through while you're throwing the charge attack. But sometimes it may not work, right? Sometimes you're giving your opponent 3 turn, a free fast move when you throw the energy, right? And that sometimes is not good. So the expected turns to give up in this case is actually 3 times 1 minus p, p representing the success of denying your opponent fast move. So if you have, if you think you have 60% chance of denying your opponent fast move, then P here would be 60% or 0.6, and then the turns you're giving up is actually 1.2. Here represented by the negative number because we're giving up turns to your opponent. And and then it goes in cycles for 4, 5, 6. Or for every 1 plus 3n fast moves before throwing, or 2 plus 3n and 6 plus 3 plus 3n, or 3n's, right? So what are some points to take from this chart? It's worthy to deny if we're trying to optimize. Let's say if we're trying to optimize the turns that we want to give up, we want to give up as little turns as possible, then it would be worth it to deny if you think that this number, -3 times 1 minus p, is greater than -1, which would refer to a probability of greater than 67%. So this means that it is worth it to attempt denying your opponent fast moves if you have gauged from the past that there is a greater than 67% chance of success. And this is just under the 2-turn versus 3-turn scenarios. I'm going to show the other charts, and you guys are going to see that this probability will change for different scenarios. And second of all, sometimes we can consider to give up only 1 turn by throwing after 1 fast moves, 4 fast moves, 7 fast moves, or anything that's 1 plus 3n number of fast moves. This also prevents a possible sacrificial swaps from your opponents because you're throwing your energy in the middle of their fast attack. So the catch is also that you have to make sure your opponent is throwing their fast move instead of waiting for you to throw and then them trying to catch, right? But in this case, you also have to tank the damage. But it's not possible for your opponent to sack swap, which is a very important thing to consider. And also, we're only giving up 1 turn, which in many cases it's probably the most optimized turns to give up to your opponent, right? But then there's another thing to consider is, do we want to tank the damage? Do we think that we can survive the damage, or do we want to prevent the damage from registering when we throw the energy? For example, let's say you're Abomasnow and you can only tank 1 fire spin. If you throw after if you try to throw at 4, then you're gonna die, right? You're gonna die to the third fire spin. All right, let's say you can tank 2, but you won't survive the third fire spin. So if you try to time it so that you throw at 4, you're not gonna be able to survive to actually throw your charge moves. So it might actually be better sometimes, to throw without taking the damage, or if you just want to preserve your Pokemon. And you don't want to tank that damage, maybe you want to transfer that damage to something in the back which can tank it better. In that case, you can throw at 2, 5, 8, or anything that's 2 plus 3 in number of fast moves. In this case, you're giving up 2 turns, but it prevents the fast move damage from going in. And also, you are also preventing your opponent from sack swapping, right? Because it's in the middle of their fast move animation. And all right, so the variance for those 3 turn for the syncing up will always be greater than 0 as well, meaning that there will be uncertainties. The calculation can be done here in the bottom with the asterisk sign, but it's not important what the actual number is. It's actually determined on the probability of success. But it's important to know that there will be uncertainties if you try to sync up the fast moves and try to deny their fast moves, right? There are sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it works. There will be some deviations from the expected turns. All right, next up, this one is a very interesting one that I've always wondered about. So it's a 2-turn fast move versus 4-turn fast move. There are actually only 2 choices you can go for. You can only throw at 1 plus 2n fast moves or at 2 plus 2n fast moves. If you throw after 1, then you're giving up 2 turns. But the variance is always 0, so you're always giving up 2 turns, right? The damage taken, you don't take the damage because the damage is registered at the 3, right? For a 4-turn fast move, the damage is registered at the 3rd turn. And again, it's not possible for your opponent to sack swap because it's right in the middle. And then we have, if you throw after 2 fast moves, it perfectly syncs up because at all even numbers, when you for the 2-turn fast move, it syncs up with the 4-turn fast moves, right? So the expected turns that we're giving up will be -4 multiplied by 1 minus p. P again is represented by the probability of success of denying your opponent fast move. So here, when is it worth it to deny if we're trying to optimize for the turns or to minimize the turns we're giving up to my opponent? In this case, if this number is greater than -2, and that represents that will refer to a probability of greater than 50%, meaning that it will be worth it to attempt denying your opponent fast move if you think there is a greater than 50% chance of success. But it's always more consistent if you give up 2 turns by throwing after 1, 3 at odd numbers of fast moves. And this prevents a possible sacrificial swap from your opponent, and also prevents your opponent fast move damage registering. So I'm not sure how to weight these 2 factors in compared to the expected turns to give up, because sorry about that. Because the damage taken and the opponent sack swap is always arbitrary. Sometimes you don't want to take the damage. Sometimes you're afraid that your opponent is going to make a sack swap. So you want to prevent those from happening, even though you're giving up some turns, right? For me personally, I would always go for consistency over the possibility of denying your opponent fast move, unless it's something that you have to do in order to win the game, right? For example, in the Swampert versus Galvantula matchup, if you just throw at the odd numbers of fast moves, so when you throw at 1, 3, 5, 7, you should always win that matchup. You actually would only lose that matchup if you try to sync up and then your opponent got a free Volt Switch. So what does that mean? That means a lot of times you don't want to do that, right? You want to go for a consistent win, right? You always want to consistently beat your opponent's Swampert, or beat your opponent Galvantula as a Swampert. So a lot of times it's probably better to go for the consistency, unless you have to deny your opponent fast move in order to win the game, right? To gain that advantage to win the game. Alright, next up, we're just going to go over the last 2 turn fast move versus 5 turn fast move timing chart. In all the fast move timing chart that I made, or charge move timing chart that I made, I ignored the ones that had similar turns, because then in that case, there's only one possible outcome. It's always going to be random, right? There's always going to be the probability of denying your opponent and the probability of not denying your opponent, right? So 2 turn fast move against 5 turn fast move. There are actually 5 possible choices. You can throw at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1 plus 5 in, 2 plus 5 in, which just goes back in loops compared to before. If we throw at 1, we're giving up 3 turns. If we're throwing at 2, we're giving up 1 turn. And then if we're throwing at 4, we're giving up 4 turns. If we're throwing it after 3. If we're throwing after 4, we're giving up negative 2 turns. It's actually very interesting to notice that if you throw after 1, 3, and 4, the damage taken and opponent sack swap situations factors are actually exactly the same. So in the case to consider between 1, 3, 4, you should always go for 4, because in that case you're giving up the least amount of turns, right? Because the damage taken, none of them are taking the damage, and the sack swap is always not possible for 1, 3, and 4. So for number 2 though, if you want to throw after 2, in that case you are actually reducing the turns you're giving up. You're giving up 1 less turn, but you do have to there's always a trade-off. So in this case, the trade-off is that you have to take the damage if you try to throw after 2 fast moves. And then the most important one is we want to throw after 5 fast moves. In this case, we're giving up a -5 times 1 minus p turns. P again represented by the probability of successfully denying your opponent fast move while you're throwing. In this case, you're only going to get a greater than 1 or a greater than -1 turns to give up here if your p-value is greater than 80%, meaning that it's almost never worth it to attempt to deny your opponent, unless you think that you are just really good at denying your opponent, you have the best internet, you think you can deny more than 80% of the time, then yeah, go for it. But you also have to consider the variance, right? There's going to be some uncertainties when you do that. And also you do have to take the damage from the second 5-turn fast moves from your opponent. And it's also possible for your opponent to sack swap in that case, right? For me, I prefer consistency again, so I would just try to sync up at 2 by throwing after 2 or 2 plus 5 in number of fast moves, and also prevents your opponent from sacrificial swaps, right? You do have to tank the damage though, so sometimes you do want to consider doing other number of fast moves so that you give up 1 to 4 turns. So that would be in any of the 1, 3, 4 categories, in which case we do give up more turns, but we don't take the damage, right? All right, next up we have, hold on. All right, next up we just start with 3-turn fast moves versus 2-turn fast moves. This one is again very straightforward as well, because there are only 2 possible choices. You throw after odd number of turns, or odd number of fast moves, or you throw after even number of fast moves. I think I already went over a lot of things similar to this. So in this case, you only try to deny if the p-value you think is greater than 50%. For me, again, I think it's more consistent if I just throw after an odd number of fast moves, so that I'm giving up 1 turn to my opponent, but I prevent the sacrificial swap. And also it's more consistent. There's no variance in that case. There's no uncertainty. And then the damage taken in this case will always be taken, because you're against the 2-turn fast moves. So you'll always have to tank that fast move damage, which is a little bit unfortunate, but something to remember, right? Next up, we have a 3-turn fast move versus 4-turn fast move. There are 4 possible choices. You can throw after 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1 plus 4N, 2 plus 4N fast moves. So in this case, you can notice right away as well, there's no difference between 2 and 3. Well, after throwing 2 and 3, besides the expected turns to give up. So between choosing 2 and 3, you should always choose number 2. And then you can limit the turns to give up by 1 by throwing after 1 instead of throwing after 2 fast moves. In that case, you will be looking at the damage taken here. You would have to sacrifice. There's a trade-off that you have to take the damage if you try to throw after 1. But if you throw after 2, you don't have to take the damage, but you do have to give up 1 more turn, right? And then if you try to sync up the fast moves at 4, you do have to give up some. You do have to give up a uncertainty amount of turns. In this case, it will be only worth it to try to go for the deny if P is greater than 75%. Otherwise, it's always worth it to try to go for 1 fast move before you throw. And also it prevents your opponent from going for a sack swap, right? Remember that the sack swap is only possible if your opponent is synced up with you, right? Otherwise, they can never throw when they're in the middle of their attack animation, right? All right, and then 3-turn versus 5-turn. This is also very straightforward. Hold on, yeah. So again, against 5-turn fast moves, it's almost always not worth it to go for the deny to try to sync up the fast move, unless you think you have greater than 80% probability of denying that 5-turn fast moves. So for me, that's like very difficult to do. So I try to go for consistency. So I would always try to throw after 3 fast moves in this situation, in the 3-turn versus 5-turn scenarios. So in that case, I only give up 1 turn. I do have to take the damage. So if I want to avoid taking the damage, I would throw after 1 turn, right? So that you don't have to take that damage. And next up, we'll talk about 4-turn fast moves versus 3-turn. This one is always very interesting to me. Again, if you throw after 1 fast moves, then you don't have to tank the second. You don't have to tank the damage from the second one. And if you throw after 2, you're only giving up. After 2 fast moves, you're only giving up 1 turn to your opponent. But you do have to take the damage from their next fast move attack, and then you can sync up at 3, and this will only be worth it if you think that you have a probability higher than 67% of denying your opponent fast move because sneaking through. For me, again, I think it's always worth it to go for 2, so that I'm only giving up 1 turns. So if I'm playing against something like Hypno against Azumarill, I will go for, even if I'm already at a Thunder Punch, I would throw 2 fast moves and then go for a Thunder Punch. Generally, if you don't have to give up shields in that situation, if you don't have to risk losing that matchup, I would always try to deny your opponent or try to give up the minimal number of turns, right? So next up, we have 4 turns versus 5 turns. So against 5 turns, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's always almost never worth it to go for the sync up. So, and in this case, it's actually really hard to sync up with 4-turn versus 5-turn because you would have to sync up. You have to throw after 5 fast moves, which in that case, your opponent has already done 4 5-turn fast moves, and we know that 5-turn fast moves can generate energy really fast. So in that case, you might not want to wait that long. Maybe you want to consider throwing after 1 fast move or 2 fast move. So again, as you guys can notice, between throwing after 2 or throwing after 3, throwing after 4, there's no significant difference besides the fact that you're giving up more turns, right? So you should always try to throw after 1 or 2 fast moves in this case, or 1+5N and 2+5N fast moves. The advantage of throwing after 1 or after 1+5N is that you only give up 1 turn, but you do have to take the damage. But then again, your opponent is not able to sack swap. And then the advantage of throwing after 2 or 2+5N fast moves is that you only give up 2 turns, and also you don't have to tank the damage, right? I ignored 1-turn fast moves in my comparisons and 5-turn fast moves in our comparisons, because 1-turn fast moves are very easy to compute, and you just have to follow the same logic, depending on if you want to only give up 1 turn, or do you want to risk giving your opponent a free move, or do you want to not tank the damage but try to give up the least amount of number of turns while not taking the damage, right? And then 5-turn is very clunky. It's very hard to go for these type of strategies in order to avoid giving up too many turns, because it takes too long and your opponent might already be throwing, so you have to go back to at the beginning of after 1 or after 2, right? So 5 is very tricky. I think a lot of times if you are using the 5-turn fast moves, it's very dependent on the situation, on how you want to throw. There is almost no good way to quantify that, right? Because it's very situational dependent. All right, so you always want to consider whether you're willing to risk giving your opponent an extra free fast moves when you are throwing your charge move. Because let's say the example that I gave earlier, Swampert versus Galvantula, generally it's a good matchup, right? But if your opponent is able to sneak an extra Volt Switch, that matchup is flipped. And this could be true for a lot of situations, right? If you're playing Gallade versus something like Alolan Ninetales, if you sneak a Confusion through, or if your opponent is the Gallade and he sneaks a Confusion through while you're throwing your Weather Ball, that could be extremely dangerous, because then they might actually flip that matchup as well, right? So these are always some things that you want to consider. Here are some conclusions that I made for myself, or you could definitely think about this as well for yourself. So personally, I don't have faith in my internet at consistently denying my opponent fast moves. I just don't think it's very consistent in my case. A lot of times I feel like I can never do it, so I just prefer consistency. I just give up 1 turn, give up 2 turns to my opponent. It doesn't matter as long as it's not game losing, right? I would only try to deny my opponent fast move if I think that I have to do it in order to win the game. For example, if I give the 1 turn, I will not reach the move before my opponent. If I will reach the move 1 turn slower by not going for the deny, then I will go for the deny, right? Because that's the only way to win the game. And also, if you have in mind a concrete probability of your rate of denying your opponent fast moves from your past experience, then you can gauge when you can go for the deny. If you think you have 90% probability of denying, then you can deny 2 turn, 3 turn, 4 turn, 5 turn. You can always go for those because the expectation is always high. It's always in your favor to go for the deny. But for someone like me, where I think my probability is probably like 50%, then I would never deny anything, right? Because it doesn't actually bring me an advantage in terms of expectation, and it only brings more uncertainty to the gameplay. So in that case, in my case, if I only think I have 50% probability, I would always try to optimize for giving up 1 turn or giving up 2 turns instead of possibly giving my opponent a 4-turn fast move or 3-turn fast move, because that can totally flip the game, right? For example, number 3 bullet point here: if a failed deny could turn the game around, you should definitely choose consistency. Like the example that I keep giving out earlier, Swampert versus Galvantula, it could be very risky if you try to go for a deny and not successful, right? Even the other matchup that I mentioned earlier, Hypno versus Azumarill, generally a very good matchup for the Hypno, but if you try to deny and then they sneak an extra bubble, maybe they were able to get to an extra Ice Beam, right? And that could be a lot of times game losing. And then lastly, you want to consider the damage registration. And sometimes it's better to avoid taking damage before throwing the charge moves, right? So for example, if you have Abomasnow versus an opponent Talonflame, if you're going to die to one Incinerate, then you can't really optimize by throwing it after 2 Powder Snows, because after you do 2 Powder Snows, your Abomasnow is going to be dead, right? So you'd have to do 1 Powder Snow, and then you can throw. And then you can actually transfer that damage to something else in the back, and you will still have a decent amount of health on your Abomasnow for later stages, right? So I think there's no concrete the right answer, but there's definitely a lot of things that you can think about to improve your gameplay. And while you're playing the game, you can always think through what your plan is, if you need to deny, if you don't need to deny, if consistency will work just as fine, right? So these are some things to think about, and I hope that these you find these charts helpful for planning your gameplay or your teams, right? And yeah, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more if you enjoyed these type of videos. Make sure to comment below if you think this concept is interesting, this type of video is interesting, and I will see you guys in my next video.